The mage who turned himself to ice was still perched upon that table in the middle of the first room. They heard nothing from the creepy guy who was last seen in one of the cells in the lower dungeon. The scatter of salt and clothing in that larger hall with overturned furniture was left untouched. That circular rune on the upper floor remained cold and dormant. The secret door in the wall of that storage space stood open, yet to be given a notion to do anything else. That corridor leading to the chamber where the hot spring was still offered the faint light at the end. Bypassing all of these once discoveries, Claire followed Imala, who walked close behind Samson. He could have floated his way across each room and up the stairs. He could have broken his humanoid form and dashed his way to the hot spring, leaving her and Imala to catch up. Instead, he kept his form and walked through each space with them. All the while, he filled those chambers with his voice. Really, I set up the second set of rings to test my theory. If it's true, Imala won't have to play by the same rules Asham set up for his community. What theory? Claire asked. That the rings do transform those who take part in them, he answered. But it all depends on what you want that to be. Claire furrowed her brow. What do you mean? I mean, he continued, like how those of that community wanted to be what they called beyond, I wanted something different from the rings. Different, Claire said, waiting on him to explain more. They had reached the end of that corridor and were looking down at the hot spring at the bottom of the cave. Even more of the candles had fizzled out since last time. Claire was surprised any of them were still burning. The majority of the ones still lit were those along the outer edge of the chamber. There were enough to expose the contours of the uneven floor and the overall shape of the central fixture. Samson led them down the slope as he continued to explain. To simplify things, the rings, as they are called, do require payment so that the one participating will be worthy of receiving what they wish for. Asham only knows how to use the rings a certain way, so he's teaching others those same rules. Reaching the bottom of the slope, Samson continued forward. Claire was going to follow him, but she noticed Imala was standing in place. It didn't take her long to understand why. The dead necromancer still lay where she and Samson left her. If she understood right, Imala hadn't taken payment from this mage. After what Imala went through at the other hot spring, was she tempted? Would it take just one more payment? This set of rings apparently hadn't been established yet, but perhaps the other one left such an impact that she wouldn't tempt this sight in the slightest. Samson stood before the hot spring and turned to look back at the two girls. The breaths coming off his body dwindled before striking at the flames of those outlying candles. Claire took a second to study this, surprised his very presence didn't just blow them all out. Did he have enough control over his form at this point to consider his surroundings in such a way? I guess you could say I was a little impatient, he said. Or maybe I just didn't understand the rules Asham explained until afterward. Well, Claire asked, which is it? Samson lifted his wavy hands in a shrug. I guess both. Lowering his hands, he continued. Assam said you have to complete multiple rings to finally become beyond. As soon as I completed the first ring, well, I chose right then to... He spread his arms to present himself. Become what I am now. So, Claire began, it doesn't take multiple times? Once again, Samson lowered his hands. Apparently not. When I stood before the first sight, I simply wished to transform. Claire considered his words, and then responded. What that other guy said about another form rising up out of the hot spring, looking like you, was that? Yeah, Samson nodded. I think they believe I summoned an elemental, even though I told them I didn't learn that part of the arcane arts. So what was it? Claire asked. I mean, was it... She nodded at his body. This, or... It presented me with the new body I asked for, Samson answered. New body, Imala whispered, her eyes sparkling. Samson's smile widened. That's right. And then you stepped into it, Claire stated. That's what that guy said. I was giving up one body for the other, Samson explained. Asham believed the physical body was to be sacrificed in the end. Maybe that's what happened, but all I know is that I now live in this form, the one I wanted. So, Imala began, taking a meek step forward. I lose this body to obtain another, Samson said. What kind of body do you wish for? One like mine? Another type? Was there something you've always dreamed of being? To be free, Imala said, wearing a hopeful smile. Samson placed a wavy hand upon his rippling chest. I chose this body so that I could be the wind, to go to and fro through the land at my leisure. I can even soar in the skies if I want to. Someone can only touch me if I allow them. With this form, I'm that much closer to the threshold between the physical and the spiritual. You see how I move, how free I am now. I do, Imala said, clasping her hands together and bunching her shoulders around her ears. It's like before when we were setting this site up, Samson said, to gain the right to sacrifice your body for another. Payment, Claire said. She didn't have enough. She started to look down at the dead mage laying near Imala, but she had a feeling that Samson dismissed such a payment already. But she does have something she can give up before sacrificing her own body, Samson said. What is that? Imala asked. Your arcane knowledge, he answered. Claire took a step toward him. What? Wait, how? My obfuscation? Imala questioned. Those shadows you carry with you, Samson began. You won't need them anymore when you receive your new body. But how does one give that up? Claire asked. That's knowledge. What are you supposed to do? Forget it or something? She snorted at the idea. Or, Samson offered, she can give it to you, Claire. Both women regarded one another. Claire was the first to turn back to Samson. Okay, you said this wouldn't take long, but in order for me to learn what she has, that'll take years. Not unless I help you, Samson said. How? Claire asked. Samson chuckled. I figure you get that coming in contact with someone like me or Asham has an effect. Imala grinned. Claire scowled. Yeah, I get that. It's something to do with the rings, Samson said, regarding the hot spring. Like Asham said, there is a glimmer or some type of mark left on a person once they've taken part in the rituals. Even now, though I'm free, there is a, let's just say, a spiritual tether connecting me with the rings. The knowledge that establishes these rings around these hot springs is imprinted upon us. He looked back at the girls. With this body, I'm like a conduit. I can take knowledge from someone and bestow it to another. Imala stepped toward him. Really? Claire was narrowing her eyes again. That almost sounds too good to be true, Samson asked, and then snickered. It's something I've learned about myself recently. Actually, it's something I think I've figured out about the rings themselves. That whole switch that happens at the end. Basically an exchange. It's more than physical. As a matter of fact, it's beyond physical. I think that's the whole point. The spiritual is limitless. It's more like ideas than objects. Someone's will in action. That's why Asham calls it beyond. So, Claire asked, could Asham do that? Exchange knowledge just by contact? Samson shrugged. He should be able to. But you two couldn't touch each other, Imala said, stopping a foot away from him. Claire studied her. She and Imala were both sweating because of the humidity near the hot spring, but she could see Imala's breathing was a little labored now. No, Samson answered. It seems knowledge only flows in one direction. What do you mean by that? Claire asked. Samson tilted his head up in consideration. I guess the best way to explain it is that spiritual gains nothing from the physical. The physical is always in lack. So, Claire began, is that the only reason why he doesn't know what already happened when you completed the first ring? Imala laughed. Because he couldn't touch you. Samson winked at her. You remembered? Claire lowered her head and touched the side of her brow. He just missed his chance? Yeah, Samson laughed. Because he's beyond. He closed himself off from the physical, in a sense. Closed himself off? Claire asked. There are many other truths he desires, Samson explained. All spiritual. Think of it like he can no longer relate to people anymore. So, he shrugged. I believe he was trying to do the same thing I want to do here. He thought you had knowledge and wanted to transfer it to all those people back there. Samson shook his head. He wouldn't have benefited in the least. Claire stared off into her thoughts. That's why he was trying to use us to get to you. She returned her gaze to him. When he did touch us, we didn't know. Samson pointed at her. And I bet your cloak totally closed him off from your mind. That's why the summoner was trying to get me to tell him what you did, Claire added. Because I can summon elementals. Samson nodded. Yeah, they weren't getting anything from me, and they knew that. Claire approached and stood at Imala's side. Let's say I believe you about this whole transferring ability. Okay, Samson snickered. Well, I suddenly get all this knowledge of obfuscation, Claire continued. Does that mean I'll gain her experience too, or just simply know things? Samson shrugged. Don't know. I guess you'll do with that knowledge what you will. He then chuckled. Claire scowled at him. Suddenly having all that knowledge when I didn't before, that's got to have some type of negative effect. Why negative? Samson asked. Come on, Samson, Claire scoffed, but remembered what he just said about not being able to relate to people anymore, and her heart sank a little. So much of what she feared was now confirmed. Not only that, but was she now going to have to explain things to him as if she was teaching a child? A person doesn't suddenly know everything about something. They have to learn it as they go. There's time and experience involved. Cheating like that, don't you think that'll put some weird stress on a person's mind? Recalling her fears in regard to his changes, now she approached him in a different manner. And what if I don't even want it? This is only to test your theory anyway. It's for you and Imala. All I might get out of this is brain damage. Asham only lied about some things, Samson said. But the one thing he didn't lie about was the withdrawal-like effects the rings have on a person. Imala has already begun them. She can't back out now. Claire shoved Imala's shoulder. Aren't you mad about that at all? I mean, come on. Imala righted her posture and shook her head. No, I'm not. Claire, don't you feel the same way as we do? Don't you want your freedom from the agency? So you jumped into something you hardly know anything about, Claire scolded. Imala reached out and laid a hand upon Samson's wavy arm. Because I trust him. Claire watched the effect wash over her face when making contact with him. Imala asked a question with a dreamlike smile. Don't you? Claire's fears toward her already losing herself in all this were more than confirmed. She targeted the two shadowed pits in Samson's face. I thought I did, but then he went off and did all this without telling me. If I told you before, Samson laughed, then you'd be in trouble with the agency too. But still, Claire spat, stepping right up to him, you could have told me something. She felt a draft coming off his body. It was only touching her face, but even with just that much, she felt as though he was cradling her chin with his hand. The sensation brought tears to her eyes. Claire? Imala whispered. She had heard the break in Claire's voice at the end. The two shadowed pits in Samson's face widened. Oh, wow. What? Claire demanded. Samson's expression softened. Now there's a look I've never seen on you before. Are you actually... Yeah, so what? Claire snapped, reaching up and yanking her hood from her head. Her long parted bangs fell loose along her cheeks, framing her face now that her hood no longer did. With the shadows gone, both Samson and Imala could see the tears resting along her lower eyelids. Now the sensation she felt from his gust enveloped her entire head. If she didn't know any better, she would have let all the strength deplete from her legs and simply hang from his invisible fingers. "You two lovebirds go off by yourselves," she chided with a shaky voice. "And where does that leave me? I'll be stuck in the agency." She lowered her face. "Alone." The tears fell down her cheeks. Samson frowned. Then he regarded Imala, who shared his gaze. When he returned to Claire, he spoke with a sad smile. "You are always different from us, you know." Claire's head popped up. "What?" Samson's shoulders relaxed. "You know what it takes to pay for these rituals. You aren't someone who can do that, right?" Claire wiped at her cheeks. "But Imala and I are," Samson continued. Claire furrowed her brow. But I've killed before. Taking a life is..." "But not for yourself," Samson said. "Always for the mission." Claire tried to think of something to say. "But..." "I think it's best for you to let people like us go, Claire," Samson said. Claire scoffed. "You think those in the agency are any better?" "Isn't that why you'd feel alone?" Samson asked. Claire lowered her head with a grunt, gritting her teeth. "There's no going back for me," he added. "For Imala either." He and Imala exchanged smiles. "If you still have some allegiance to the agency," he continued, returning to Claire, "then perhaps this new knowledge will help you cope a little better." With her head lowered, she didn't see him reaching for her. When his wavy palm pressed into her brow, she gasped. All the strength left her body as his ethereal hand sunk into her head. Her vision blurred and spasmed, showing her nothing and multiple colors all at once. Beside her, Imala watched with wide eyes, her hands clutched together against her chest. She too was caught off guard when Samson thrust his other palm against her brow. She went rigid, her eyelids fluttering when her voice got caught in her throat. When his ghostly hand sunk into her head, he spoke. "Be focused and intentional about your arcane knowledge. Once it's at the forefront, it'll be isolated, and I will transfer it over. Become empty so that you can give yourself over to what's next." Both girls convulsed at the ends of his ethereal wrists, their bodies being brushed by the currents that wafted from him. Claire wanted to object, but then she didn't. She wanted to fight back, but then she wanted to lower her guard. She wanted to yell at him to stop, but then she wanted to keep silent. She wanted to keep everything that wasn't hers away, but then she was greedy for it. She didn't want to cheat like this, but then she was hungry for more. She didn't want to take from her friend, but she would have devoured Imala if she could. There was a frenzy of colors, but they couldn't be defined by their names. That wasn't the point. They were all the physical could do to translate the spiritual. There were no terms for concepts, but she knew what they were. Language was absent, but she could have rambled on about mindsets, mechanics, and tools she thought she had never used before. She was happy, even though she couldn't explain why. She might have been someone else, and she didn't care. And then there was blankness.